Automated Podcast.
Welcome to Automated. I'm your host, Mark Verbenkov, and in this weekly podcast, we will be exploring the impact of emerging technology on jobs, society, as well as us, with business and technology leaders, researchers, and independent professionals across the world. So one of the elephants in the room whenever we talk about automation or increasing digitalization really has to do with hacking and digital vulnerabilities. So whether we are discussing your business's online infrastructure or a new fleet of autonomous vehicles or the growing IoT infrastructure across smart cities, manufacturing hubs, and elsewhere, I think that cybersecurity has often been the uncomfortable point that we don't really want to consider very much. So of course, automation and digital tools offer us such tremendous benefits that it might actually be hard to think that more problems might arise rather than the benefits that they will bring. With my guest today, Robert Dickinson, co-founder and CTO at Resurface Labs, we discuss the growing need of cybersecurity today, what do current cyber threats look like, what the future of hacking and security might look like, and how can you and your business best prepare for this future. So before founding Resurface Labs, Rob's technical and leadership skills were honed at Intel, Dell, and Quest Software, but his true passion is listening and learning from customers. After 15 years of experience in the APM market, Rob started Resurface with the goal of creating first-party observability solutions where customers truly own their data and where security and privacy controls are seamlessly integrated. Hi there, Rob. Thanks for coming on to the Automated Podcast. It's great to have you here today to talk about the Internet of Things, cybersecurity, and some of the other interesting angles that we'll be touching on. So thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. So as I mentioned right before the recording, I always start off the podcast with a little bit more of a personal touch. So it'd be great for you to kind of just give the audience a little bit of a flavor for like what made you interested in IoT, cybersecurity, and some of the other things that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, the thing that fascinates me about this whole revolution that we're witnessing here is that we started off with an internet that was built for humans, built for people. And what we're doing is we're actively replacing that with a web that's really built for machines and programs to interact with each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fundamental shift, culturally, technically, ethically, spiritually, maybe, who knows? but it's certainly a big difference from where we started off.
Very cool. I actually haven't heard it being put that way. So now you're getting me a little bit more interested in IoT than before. So one of the things that our mutual contact sent to me beforehand was like you have a kind of maybe a vision or an idea as to like how IoT will change the world. So I think it's a good way to kind of maybe set the conversation in some sort of more interesting context. So if you could maybe touch on like, first, what exactly is IoT for maybe some of the listeners that haven't heard about it before, but then also like tie it into like how it will change the world in kind of maybe an interesting way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one easy way to think about it is, again, a lot of what we saw with the Web 1.0 was this centralization of computing power and centralization of data, centralization of knowledge. And I think what we're witnessing with IoT is the decentralization of that. And it's not that we won't have these public cloud services that are very powerful, obviously, but we're always going to be fighting the physics of that. We're always going to be fighting the fact that light only goes so fast, information only travels so fast. And it's funny, remember the Tom Watson quote that everyone misquotes about how there's only going to be one computer per continent, and the world market for computers is only like 7 or something. What he was really thinking was about the physics, the fact that you don't want to send your signals to literally the other side of the world to do your computation. So you'll probably have a North America computer, a South American computer. That was really like what they were thinking about, right? But what we see today is consumers and systems needing faster latency than that, and also having data residency requirements, jurisdictional requirements that are really being applied, as you would in the physical world, but to the virtual world. And that's leading to this massive decentralization. And so that's really, I think, an easy way to think about IoT is it's a collaboration between low cost, low power computing at the edge, sitting right next to the user or right next to the device, and then that working in concert with backend cloud services like we understand them today.
Okay, super interesting. So as the machine world, if you will, if the physical world will start to become online as they're being connected to the internet across the world, one of the things that I keep hearing about, and I have to say I'm not fully, I don't fully maybe understand it as maybe as well as you do, are APIs. I've heard the term floating around several times. I'm probably even sure I've used APIs a couple times. But if you could specifically state like how or what APIs are and how they are so integral to the world of the Internet of Things that's starting to come around.
Yeah, so here's a really easy way to think about it. So if we're thinking about the metaphor of moving from human-based conversations online to machine-based conversations online. Well, if we're talking about humans, well, that's emails and snaps and tweets, right? And so we understand what those data elements look like, and we understand, how an email gets handed off and all of that. When we shift to an internet for machines, the way that those machines and computers and programs interact with each other is through API calls. So API, it's a scary acronym, right? But it stands for Application Programming Interface, which really doesn't tell you a lot necessarily. But what it really is it's the conversation between those programs, and it's a conversation that's happening over the web, over a public internet, public network in most cases. And so we then can think about tapping or recording or surveilling or auditing, whatever word you want to use, those conversations between those machines by auditing those API calls, the same way that we might have thought about recording phone conversations. If it was back in the 80s or 90s and you were talking to your stockbroker over the phone and you hear that robot voice that says your call may be recorded for quality assurance, right? Having that understanding that conversation's being recorded, that there's a record of that conversation. We think that's ultimately where this is going online, is not only are you going to have all these programs and automated systems that are communicating with each other, but then you also need an audit trail. In the physical world, when I buy something, I get a receipt.
Right.
And I know that there's a record of that transaction, but that's certainly not the standard of care that we see today.
Right.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet. Well, thanks for that. It's much clearer in my own mind now. So I was actually having a conversation with some of my colleagues this past week, and of course, cybersecurity came up. We were talking about autonomous vehicles and the increasing IoT infrastructure that's going on around us. And there was a conversation about the security of the new machines that are going to be able to be hacked. I mean, there's already been several hacks on, say, autonomous vehicles. I think Tesla even had a bounty program set up so that people could find out whether the vehicles could be hacked. But that's just like one example, right? There's as this IoT world is coming online, I think that the cybersecurity aspect is going to become so much more important because things won't exist in a vacuum anymore. They will be susceptible, or there will be at least the possibility that some nefarious actor can get into them and change them in some way and cause maybe some damage if it's like a piece of equipment or something like that. Could you touch on or maybe elaborate that point on like why cybersecurity is so important in this kind of new internet that we're experiencing?
Yeah, two quick answers for that. The first answer is that all of these security things that we're seeing, in some sense, are a failure of imagination. Okay. The best attacks are novel. They're creative. they're using these systems in ways that they're not exactly designed to be used that way,
Right.
right? And exploiting those qualities. And that's part of what makes cybersecurity difficult to improve, and why it fundamentally makes those attacks difficult to guard against, because those threats are always changing and always morphing and always becoming more sophisticated. The second observation is that the volume of these attacks is so much different than it used to be. Back in the day when I first got started building web systems and websites, if you got hacked or you got probed, it was almost like a badge of honor. Like,
Okay.
like
That's a very interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah.
right? Like, well, look at how
Yeah.
popular we are. Look how much attention
Right.
we're getting. That, like, we would get this kind of negative attention
Hmm.
that comes with that, and it was almost like a sign that you're doing things well, or something like that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
now as soon as you expose an endpoint to the public internet, regardless of what the intent of that was, it's going to be probed immediately and continuously for the entire life that thing is connected. And it doesn't matter what your terms of service says. It doesn't matter what your contracts say. It doesn't matter if it's an API that can really only be accessed from your mobile app,
Right.
or only be accessed from a certain kind of IoT device. Well, guess what? Because that endpoint is exposed, that means that it's possible for that endpoint to be discovered and probed. And in fact, that happens so quickly and in such enormous volume. I mean, a lot of the customers that we talk to, literally their malicious traffic is the majority of the traffic that they see on a daily basis. It is not an exception case at all. So you think about, well, like, what would that look like in the physical world? What would my bank look like if half the people that showed up and walked through the front doors of the bank were there to rob the place?
Right.
I would have to conduct business very differently in that kind of environment, right? And that's literally what's shifting around us in the cybersecurity realm right now. It's a lot of the folks that I talk to, there's not really the sense that we're winning the war here. We're maybe at best just hanging on.
Okay. And so if I'm envisioning this, right, if I'm looking at, say, like when you first got involved in it, you were saying it was a badge of honor to be hacked, or at least attempted to be hacked. I would assume that would be like an actual individual, a human being behind the computer trying to do that. I'm assuming that that's not the case anymore, right? It would maybe be some sort of bot that would be trying to do some sort of phishing attack, but maybe also now we've been hearing a lot about, say, like China or Russia taking on like state actors, having entire departments where they're trying to hack certain individuals or certain companies in the West. Is it maybe a mix between the two, that there's some sort of artificial intelligence doing the work of hackers, or it's also the nefarious kind of bad state actors that are doing that kind of the majority of the kind of hacks that are out there now?
That's a great question, and I think from the folks that we've talked to, there seem to be two camps out there. There's the camp of the script kiddies, the folks who are kind of the brute force attackers, and those are kind of some of the classic attacks, right? We're going to look for unsecured SQL Server instances, or we're going to look for unpatched, Apache servers, and we're going to use those vulnerabilities in the system to try to get in. And I think that's kind of how we think about attackers in kind of more of a classical sense, because they're outsiders, right? It's more of a perimeter security model, and if we can keep those bad folks out, then our systems will be okay. But the folks that we talk to, the attacks that are the most insidious are where these attackers actually sign up as paying customers.
Okay.
So you are inviting them in, like the same way that you invite in a real customer, and if you think that the Russians and the North Koreans, I mean, they have the money to spend on the talent, right? So of course they have the money just to sign up as a paid user.
Right.
It's even worse. It's even worse if you have a free
Yeah.
service, and they can just come in and keep recycling accounts. But even if you say, hey, we're going to do a credit card check, or we're going to put, we're going to charge for this up front, that won't deter them. That's fine. They've got the budget. And so what we really need to move towards is more of a zero trust model where, I mean, it sounds paranoid to say it this way, but you really can't trust anyone. You
Yeah.
really can't trust, you can't have God mode administrators any more than you can have your systems just exposed without any controls. How you actually assert control and proper guidance and proper authority in that kind of scenario. I mean, that's the challenge really of what we're dealing with today in cybersecurity.
Right. And I guess also the severity of the attacks or the severity of the consequences are so much more now as we're seeing this IoT infrastructure grow as compared to before, what it would be like a website would be hacked, or, at the worst, your bank credentials would be hacked and you might lose, I don't know, some or all of your funds. I mean, it's still quite a bit, but now we're seeing maybe, you have infrastructure, you have equipment in manufacturing, these sorts of things could be hacked as as I said, as the IoT infrastructure is grown out and scaled up.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we're really starting to see now that's a fairly new thing is also network effects in these attacks. So you have a breach in one vendor or one digital property, and there's a bunch of account information that gets stolen, right? Well, that the hackers that got that set of accounts, well, they're going to take that account information and they're going to try it on other digital properties because they
Right.
know that people reuse their account names and passwords.
Right.
So even when you think about breaches, like the fact that someone else was breached, there's no celebration there. It's not like and it's not like you can there's nothing positive about that, because even though they were breached and it might not have been your fault, well, some of your accounts may end up being compromised through that process. And how do you guard against these kinds of things that are relatively new? And this is evolving constantly. I mean, what we're talking about, we're only becoming more interconnected and more interdependent. Our supply chains are only getting longer and more complicated.
Yeah.
So I think we're only going to see more of those kind of network effects.
Yeah. Maybe to follow up on that, I read a really interesting article a couple of years ago. I can't remember who wrote it, but it was talking about the systemic risks of increasingly complex systems. Right. So as whatever system we're talking about gets more and more complex, of course, it brings so much more benefit to the world. But I mean, it's so relevant to when we're talking about cybersecurity and digital security in general, where you have one breach and the whole network can go down, not just part of it, but like an entire thing. And if we're talking about, I mentioned autonomous vehicles, right? There's the scary possibility that if, in 10, 20 years time, if there's a large amount of autonomous vehicles on the roads, one hack could essentially shut down, like, I don't know, like the Western seaboard or something like that of all autonomous vehicles, if the proper precautions are not put into place. But then maybe even then, so if you're talking about these novel attacks constantly happening, maybe it's just kind of an inevitability. Something to consider, I guess.
I think the really interesting philosophical question is how much appetite do we have to fix these things ahead of being bruised, right? And part of it's because, again, part of it isn't just the intent, but the fact that these threat vectors are evolving very quickly. And at the same time, security is certainly one of those domains where you want to be able to make predictions about what's going to happen and what the policies should be and what the proper outcomes should be. But you're trying to base that on technology that is extremely complex and changing very quickly. and has a lot of creative people involved in coming out with new kinds of attacks and new kinds of vulnerabilities. So I think it's it's not like there's a kind of invention. I'm a huge fan of AI, and there's so much money going into AI, but I hate to be the one to bust the bubble. Like it's not just a matter of putting an AI in that can do better perimeter security and somehow keep all the bad people out. If you think about half of your traffic is bad actors, how do you baseline that? How do you teach an AI what's real and what's fake?
Right.
It's a huge set of problems.
Well, maybe we can then shift the discussion a little bit to I mean, this is I think it's very valuable for anybody listening to, if they haven't really thought about cybersecurity that much, or as cybersecurity started to get more and more, I guess, into the public consciousness, this is maybe a good way to like introduce this to people. But why don't we try to look at solutions, right, and not just focus on the dark aspects of things. So I mean, you're working for a company that focuses on API security. Can you maybe touch on how you guys are specifically focusing on the solutions to this kind of monumentally growing cybersecurity challenge that we face?
Yeah, what we're doing specifically at Resurface Labs is we're producing an API monitoring tool that is specifically geared towards this API first kind of economy and towards these usage patterns. So as I said before, this whole thing is predicated on a shift from a web that was based on people and browsers to one that is bots and machines and programs. And so the way that we monitor and audit that activity to know what's going on and to know where those things can be improved, also to know where we're leaking, right? Is having to compensate from that. So when you look at a lot of the web-based monitoring tools, it's things like JavaScript monitoring. It's things like Google Analytics, where you're tagging your web pages, and those web pages are sending data back to a central server. Well, that's fine, but people don't really like that. People don't really like being surveilled that way.
Yeah.
GDPR and CCPA also really go after unnecessary third-party data sharing that doesn't really have a specific business purpose attached to it. But at the end of the day, we still need that traceability. We need that observability. We need the accountability that goes with it. And so that's really what we're solving for with Resurface. We're creating an audit trail, a system of record of what your APIs are actually doing. And those could be APIs that you're providing or APIs that you're consuming. But in either case, you really do need to have a transaction by transaction record of what was going on. And again, that's because there's bad actors out there trying to use your systems in ways that you didn't intend, but it's also because you're changing these things super quickly, and everybody wants to move faster. And you also have enormous complexity. So just even being able to make predictions about how your system is going to work in all cases is increasingly difficult.
Yeah, I understand that. So one of the things I like to ask a lot of the guests is maybe to have like an example or a use case. I mean, of course, maybe not speaking about a specific client that you guys have, but to make it a little bit more tangible for people, as some of these ideas can maybe be a little bit abstract for people.
Sure, I'll change the names to prevent the guilty, to protect the guilty.
Perfect.
But one of the stories that got us started on this road with Resurface is my previous company. We were selling system monitoring tools, and so these are, tell me if my system is up or down, or if the code is running fast or slow. And we always had kind of the assumption that if the systems are available and the systems are performing, then things must be okay, right? Your users are probably okay. But we've seen very, very notable cases like the one I'm about to tell, where we had a very large vendor call us in, and they were having problems with the checkout process on their online store that does millions and millions of dollars worth of business a day.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out the problem was they had put up some new code, and this code was checking the zip code. And if your zip code ended in a 0, it would say that that's not a valid zip code. And right, because usually it's leading 0 gets thrown away, but this was actually trailing 0, which is not usually the case, you say. So everyone who was in 90210, for example, that wanted to buy a computer from this vendor would not be able to complete their transaction. They would end up in an infinite loop. And we helped them find this issue by recording all of the shopping carts, recording all the user traffic, and narrowing it down to where that problem lived. And what really inspired Resurface was the moment that we realized, well, wait, we've been recording all this traffic. Now that we know what to look for, let's go back in time and let's do a query that pulls out all the shopping carts from zip codes that ended in 0. And we went back and recovered several $million in business just by giving the vendor that one query,
right.
about who to go back and contact. And so that was really the seed moment for Resurface. Is we realized that we've reached that point where the systems can be available, but doing the wrong thing. And we've seen that over and over again. I mean, that's things like selling airline tickets for $5 instead of $5,000 that are first class international tickets.
Right.
We had another case just recently with a customer. They were serving invalid JSON, malformed JSON, in about 10% of their responses. About 10% of their user transactions were actually poisoned with bad JSON, right? Well, how did that happen? How that happened was they were fixing an unrelated bug late at night, and there's an if statement in the wrong place that put a comma in the wrong place in that specific case, right? And because it was only 10% of the time, and because it was data specific condition, it wasn't caught by their automated QA. It wasn't caught by their manual QA. It actually made it out into production. And here they are, losing real user transactions out of it. And guess what? From a traditional monitoring perspective, all that looked fine, because the requests themselves are all 200 okay, 200 okay, 200 okay, but they're serving up broken JSON. So that's that's a perfect example of you can think that things are actually working, and they're actually not working at all. And then you don't really have a record of how they were breaking. So you can imagine the customers that were actually getting those broken payloads. I mean, all they know is this stuff doesn't work.
Right.
How do I know what didn't work about it?
Pretty crazy. I was thinking, as the IoT infrastructure is going to be built out, and the kind of clients that you're dealing with, is there maybe a certain industry more than others that is going to be more susceptible to some of these hacks, some of these cybersecurity issues that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the trend that we see is these APIs showing up everywhere. Everyone wants to be an API provider. Everybody wants to participate in the API economy. So many people and organizations are waking up to the fabulous possibilities of this, of redrawing your borders between you and your suppliers and your customers and your partners and your resellers and your community. There are amazing possibilities in doing that. But at the same time, these systems are vulnerable, and these technologies that can be exploited. And it's a little bit like remember in the Matrix, where they're attacking the power plant because it has to follow the rules of a building.
Sure.
Well, it's the same thing. I mean, whether it's 5G or IoT, these are ultimately web-based APIs, and those have to follow the rules of web-based systems. And there's a huge body of knowledge about how to attack those systems, how to exploit those systems. And as that technology really becomes more commonplace, it's going to show up in organizations that really have not had to deal with those kinds of concerns in the past. You know, if I'm an auto manufacturer, I'm not used to the DevOps concerns that come with connected cars. It's not just about connecting the cars to the network and, you know, and getting a connection to the network. It's about everything that invites after that. And a lot of that stuff is going to be new for a car company. And I think that's what we're seeing. Even organizations that have run websites for a long time and are very comfortable in that domain, this is an entirely new kind of domain to be participating in.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. As I've been having many interviews over the last, say, almost 2 years now, it's been, you know, precisely when COVID hit, and one of the main things that keeps coming up when we're talking about maybe like legacy organizations is that they've had to either enter the digital age or they get left behind now. So I would be assuming that if you're dealing with some of these potential clients, not only are they being introduced for the first time to a completely new kind of digital infrastructure or digital tools that they have to utilize in order to keep their business afloat, but that they also never would have been thinking about cybersecurity concerns. Is this maybe also some place where the nefarious actors are going to? It's like kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will. Some of these businesses that have never really thought about this before, and they're probably implementing a number of incorrect systems that open them up to these kinds of attacks.
Absolutely. Look at Peloton as maybe a key example of this, right? Not a technology company, you know, obviously a company that's investing in technology, and that's a part of their brand, right? But at their heart, you know, is it deep technology? No, they're an exercise company, they're a fitness company. That's their zone of genius. They're using tech in support of that vision. And look at how easy that is for that to turn and get away from you when you're not dotting the I's and crossing all the T's. And again, that Peloton example, that's a perfect example of exploiting an actual user account. So those, you know, that was that they weren't checking their user permissions. They were saying basically anyone who is an authorized user is authorized to do anything. And that's not true. You know, anyone can fabricate a request against your API, you know, even if it's against your terms of service. Right. So what?
Yeah. That doesn't mean anything anymore.
So I think that's kind of I think a keynote example, because I think we're going to see a lot more brands that have that digital component to their brand identity. But it really is a double-edged sword. I mean, you cannot go down that road without also being very guarded about the ways that can go south on you. And again, let me just repeat that favorite line that I stole, which is, you know, these failures are really failures of imagination.
Yeah.
In the end. And so even a sophisticated organization can be exploited in this way, but you know, there's a lot of water that can be carried by a lot of attackers here.
Yeah, that's also really interesting. You made me think of so, like, of course, the podcast, the main focus here is on the future of work, how automation, how these new emerging technologies are going to be impacting work. If I'm understanding correctly, it might be that there might be a need for some sort of either cybersecurity professional in-house in many of these. I mean, of course, you have to take into consideration the size of the business in the future, apart from the kind of third-party security businesses like your own. Is that something that you see? Maybe like there will be more opportunities for jobs in, of course, the businesses that can afford a cybersecurity professional?
I think that's a huge component of this, because part of I think part of the sense that we're not necessarily winning the war here is that we're not making as many cybersecurity people as we need, right? The need here far outstrips the supply. And we're really focused on this with Resurface. So the way that we're really thinking about Resurface is as that security analyst in a box, as that API analyst in a box. And our goal is not to replace the human assets and the human intelligence. The intent is to bolster those folks, supplement those folks, make those folks more efficient. But at the end of the day, there aren't enough of those folks to go around. And so I think you absolutely need a combination of good technology and strong tools that help you separate signal from noise, that are really purpose built with this idea that your attack traffic is not a small minority of traffic, and attacks are not, you can't tell an attack by volume, for example. Like, it really has to be profiling, at a more of a user level or sequence level, what's really going on. And so that's our goal, is to provide that. We also provide that in a first party package. So the idea, and this is really novel in our industry right now, because so many of the systems that we have right now are cloud centric. And that means I'm sending all of my API data to this vendor that's going to hold that data. And what we're doing with Resurface is we have a cloud native database that you can deploy on Azure, AWS, on Kubernetes, wherever your application is already running. Just deploy it there and do your data collection right there, and keep the data there and in that same jurisdiction. And so with Resurface, you own all that data. We're just providing the software to help you maintain and protect that data set. And that is super exciting, especially when we're talking about edge deployments, because now you can talk about actually creating that system of record at the edge, not having to stream all that data back to a central location. And that opens up a lot of opportunities. Just as one example, now, if you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, for example, you can have different databases in each of those jurisdictions. And that's a much easier way to deal with some of these concerns. Again, going back to GDPR and CCPA, a lot of the bits there that have the most teeth are really about the third-party data transfer.
Okay.
So if that data stays in-house and there's a legitimate business need for it, then you need the basic safeguards to go with that. But that's still very much in bounds with respect to GDPR and CCPA.
Okay, that makes sense. I see that the time is winding down here a little bit. I still want to really focus on maybe like the future of cybersecurity and how it relates to companies and maybe even like governments and nations as a whole. So I think we've touched on it a little bit, right? There's going to be this increasing need for cybersecurity as IoT and many of these other type of web services increase over the next, say, 10 years. Are there any other kind of like interesting trends that you might see, or that you could share with the audience that you see over the next, let's just say, 10 years?
Gosh, it's a dark thing to say, but I think that the zero trust movement, I think, is really the answer to all this in the end. I mean, in the end, we have to acknowledge that regardless of what we do with the technology, people will always be the weak link. And ultimately, you're going to set up your security programs based on the idea that there's a minimum threshold in terms of number of conspirators. And the numbers vary, right, based on what literature you look at. But but most people agree, once you get past, 4 or 5 people needing to be involved in a particular attack and needing to participate in a conspiracy, it's really hard to keep that conspiracy a secret. Almost impossible. Beyond 8 to 10 people.
Right.
And so that's really what you have to think about. Is you have to think about decentralizing these things. There's always a natural tendency to create centralized databases and centralized sources of knowledge within an organization. And you have to actively push back against that. You have to actively say, let's carve this data into this silo, this data into this silo. Let's put independent systems and separate people behind those things. You can't have God mode administrators that can just willy-nilly do whatever they need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably the biggest cultural shift is we're still thinking of attackers as the other, right? The external person, the hacker overseas. And that's not really the worst threat. The worst threat is that hacker overseas is working with an insider in your organization.
Right.
And those people are extremely hard to find. So ultimately, people are the weak link, and we're going to have to design our systems based on that idea.
Okay, well, maybe a little bit darker than what I was expecting, but nevertheless, I guess important and interesting to keep in mind.
But my hope, but I think the positive part about that is that these are problems of technology, and they can be solved by technology. I mean, these are, this isn't something like climate change where we're fighting physics and human psychology at the same time. Like this is something where really we as technologists have the power to do something about this.
Right. Maybe I want to connect this idea to one of the things that we were talking about before, right? So we have all these maybe like legacy organizations coming online, if you will. We mentioned that they were probably some of the easier targets now and maybe going forward. But do you see like certain industries, certain types of businesses, maybe even governments or certain organizations, I guess, as a general concept, that will be more susceptible going forward? I mean, apart from the ones that won't be using Resurface Labs, of course.
Of course, yeah, those folks will be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's the failures of imagination, right? Yeah. It's the folks who are they're embracing the tech, but kind of grudgingly. I think part of the other challenge, and part of the way to put that, is this stuff is still hard to implement. The standards are still evolving. You look at the Biden administration guidelines on cybersecurity, for example, that were issued this year, and what that's trying to do, and that's very noble and that's very helpful to establish those standards of care. But at the same time, it's not a real blueprint. I mean, it doesn't actually tell you what should be encrypted. It doesn't tell you what level of encryption should be applied. It doesn't talk about de-identification or obfuscation. It doesn't really talk about privacy very much. These are all moving targets. And so I think one of the attitudes that we're trying to actively unwind is the idea that security is like a binary quality. That like you either have it or you don't. And if you do X, you're secure. And if you don't do X, it is in no way that simple. It's much more complicated than that. So even the standard of care of what we think about as secure and proper is changing year by year. And that's scary to a lot of businesses. I mean, that's scary. I mean, if you were to talk about compliance with the law, for example, changing that much year to year, everyone would be freaking out. I mean, if you had something like Sarbanes-Oxley that just throw you for a loop every single year, year after year after year.
Yeah, yeah.
At that level of magnitude. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about in this cybersecurity realm. So I think the folks that have the hardest time are the orgs that are really like almost getting into that begrudgingly. They're getting into it because they feel like they have to for their competitors. They're being forced to, but they're under resourced, and they're in this new world that has some really hard, rough edges to it. And that's scary. And I think that is where we need better tools to help establish those higher levels of care without the huge investment that you'd have to make today, and the fact that you're drawing on a talent pool of folks that's fairly scarce.
Yeah, maybe that's maybe one of the good points to almost end the conversation off of, right? This talent pool, the labor shortage, I guess, if you will, within the cybersecurity industry. We did touch on artificial intelligence a little bit before, but do you see, again, like in the next 10 years or so, that AI tools will become more essential to be supporting these cybersecurity professionals? I've heard the term, like a centaur team, right? You have an AI and you have a human being. They're able to do more work together than they are separately. Do you see that still being like the main trend going forward? Or do you think that at one point there will be a kind of tipping point and some of these AI systems will get better than working with a human?
I think it's going to be interesting to see. I don't have a crystal ball,
Yeah,
but
yeah, of course.
I think it's going to be interesting to see how that comes out. But I think the question that I ask when the subject of AI comes up, the question that I like to poke at is, who is training that API and who is maintaining that AI over the longer haul, right? Now, I realize that there are a lot of vendors that they will give you the pitch that they're really giving you is that they have an out of the box AI that's already trained, and basically, like, instead of hiring a person, you buy this bot and it's going to do the same thing. But think about that critically. When I hire a person, there's an investment there, even if that person is already trained in their field. And so I think we're going to have to see how the economics of caring and feeding for these AIs compares with the care and feeding of humans. And that's probably a blended workforce, right? I don't think we're talking about AI as being replacements for a good security analyst because of the creative components that come with that, and the fact those AIs are always probably going to be lagging.
Yeah.
But it's not, but it's not like you just get an AI in a box and it does it does everything that a human asset could do, without any input whatsoever. Who in your organization is going to train those AIs? How are you going to make, another big question that people are wrestling with is, how do you know that they're even doing the right thing? A lot of these AIs, you can't inspect the logic. They're not rules based. Right. So how do you know they're not biased? How do you know they're not buggy? How do you know that they're not coming up with the right answer based on the wrong algorithm? Like, you really can't. With Resurface, we're really taking a rules-driven approach, which means that these things are actually inspectable, and they don't need to be trained in a way that an AI needs to be trained. We're moving towards machine learning, but we're doing that with a rules-based approach first, and in getting the most road out of that we can. But yeah, I think a lot of people are going to be doing that calculation, especially as the AIs become a lot more capable.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a great image and a great message to end the conversation on, understanding that, yes, AIs will be important in the future, but humans, at least for the next decade, maybe 2 decades, will be still highly relevant and required in order to make the businesses and organizations of the world run in this kind of increasingly, how should I say this, the increased amount of threat when it comes to cybersecurity and hacking issues. Thanks for coming onto the podcast, Rob. It was very interesting to get maybe a little bit deeper into the cybersecurity world. I will, of course, have the Resurface Labs website link up on the show notes. Is there any other way that you want people to follow you or the work that you guys do?
Yeah, you can find us at Resurface.io. I'm also on Twitter at Rob from Boulder. Mm-hmm. And happy to connect and keep the conversation going.
Terrific. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast and the conversations here, the best way to do this is to go onto Apple Podcasts and leave a review, as it helps the algorithm to reach out to new listeners and brings the show to them. Also, feel free to check out the website, automatedpodcast.org, where you can find the show notes for each episode, written articles on the themes of the podcast, and a library of resources on the topic of emerging tech and automation. Also, if you want to reach out and leave any feedback or you have any questions about the podcast or any of the conversations, there are general contact links such as email, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. for you there on the website. And finally, for those of you that want more than just an audio conversation, the video recordings are now going to be up on YouTube for the newer conversations, so feel free to check out the videos by searching for Automated Podcast on YouTube, where of course you can like and subscribe if you prefer to support the podcast that way.
The Automated Podcast.